People usually start this conversation in a very unsatisfactory way. They say, when you die, your soul goes somewhere else. Or they say, nothing happens, you just stop. Or they say, energy is conserved, so you live on as energy. And every one of those statements sounds like an explanation, but none of them actually explains a damn thing. Let's slow down and be honest about what we're even asking. When you say, what happens when you die? What is the you in that sentence? If you don't know what you're talking about, you can't expect an answer to make sense. Right now, you're sitting there made of atoms, not special atoms. Hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen. The same atoms that are floating around in the air, in the dirt, in a glass of water. They're arranged in a very particular way. They're doing something. They're buzzing, vibrating, reacting. That activity is what you're calling you. People like to say, I am more than my atoms. That sounds deep, but it doesn't help. A pile of carbon atoms arranged one way is graphite. Arrange them another way and you get a diamond. Same atoms. Completely different behavior. So arrangement matters. Motion matters. Relationships matter. Now here's the part people don't like to look at too closely. When you die, the atoms don't disappear. They don't get sad. They don't ask where you went. They just keep obeying the same laws they were obeying before. Chemical bonds break. Other bonds form. Energy flows from one place to another. Nothing mystical required so far. But that still doesn't answer the question people care about. They're not asking about atoms. They're asking, will I still be me? So let's talk about energy, because that's another word people like to use as if it solves the problem. Energy is conserved. That's true, but energy is just a number we use to keep track of motion and interaction. When I lift a book, when a nerve fires in your brain, when the sun heats your face, we can account for energy. But conserved doesn't mean organized. It doesn't mean meaningful. A warm cup of coffee cooling down conserves energy beautifully, and yet all the interesting structure disappears. Your thoughts, your memories, that feeling you have when you recognize a face or remember a song, those are patterns. Physical patterns in a very complicated machine. When the machine stops maintaining those patterns, the patterns don't float away. They simply stop being maintained. That sounds bleak if you're hoping for a cosmic reunion, but it's actually more subtle than that and more interesting. Because now we're forced to ask a sharper question. If you is a pattern, not a thing, then what exactly has to stop for you to be gone? And even more uncomfortable, what exactly would have to continue for you to remain? That's where this starts to get strange, and that's where we have to go next. A very common dodge at this point is to say, well, consciousness is mysterious, and that's true. But mysterious is not an explanation. It's a confession. It means we don't yet know how to describe something clearly. So we give it a fancy word and hope it behaves itself. Let's try not to do that. Suppose I take a clock, a real mechanical one with gears and springs. While it's running, it tells time. You can ask it questions. What time is it? And it answers honestly. Now I stop the clock. I don't destroy it. I just stop it. Where did the time go? That question doesn't make sense. Time wasn't inside the clock. The clock was doing something. When it stopped doing that thing, the function vanished. Your brain is like that, only messier. Inside your head are about as many nerve cells as there are stars in a galaxy. They're firing, inhibiting, exciting each other in loops and layers and feedback systems that nobody fully understands yet, but we understand enough to know this. When certain patterns of activity happen, you experience something, a sound, a memory, a sense of self sitting behind your eyes. Now here's the uncomfortable part. If you interrupt those patterns, the experience changes. Drugs do it. A blow to the head does it. A lack of oxygen does it. That tells you something extremely important, whether you like it or not. The experience depends on the pattern continuing. People sometimes say, yes, but the brain is just a receiver, as if consciousness is being broadcast from somewhere else and the brain is a radio. That sounds nice, but where's the evidence? When a radio breaks, you can tune another one and get the same signal. When a brain breaks in a very specific way, a very specific part of the person vanishes. Language, face recognition, impulse control, gone, not relocated, gone. So the idea that there's a separate you floating around using the brain as a puppet doesn't explain anything better. It just adds an invisible machine on top of a visible one. Now think about death in those terms. Death is not an event where something leaves. It's an event where a process stops. The organized activity that kept rebuilding itself every second fails. Blood stops moving. Oxygen stops arriving. Electrical signals decay into thermal noise. The clock winds down. And once the pattern stops, asking where it went is like asking where yesterday went. Yesterday didn't go anywhere. It's just not happening now. But here's where people push back. They say, if that's all true, then why does being alive feel so persistent, so continuous, so solid? Why doesn't it feel like a fragile pattern barely holding together? That's a very good question. And the answer is not what most people expect, because the feeling of continuity, the feeling of being a single unbroken self, is itself just another pattern. And it's not nearly as solid as it feels. Once you see that, the question of immortality changes shape entirely. There's a trick your mind plays on you, and it's a very convincing one. It tells you that you are the same person you were yesterday. Not similar, not related, the same. But let's be careful. That statement feels obvious, but it's actually very strange. Take your body first, because that's the easy part. The atoms in you are not staying put. You breathe them in, you breathe them out. You eat them, you excrete them. Over a few years, almost none of the atoms you started with are still around. So if identity meant keeping the same atoms, you'd already be dead several times over. Fine, you say, it's not the atoms, it's the pattern. Fair enough. But even that pattern is not fixed. Your brain is constantly rewiring itself. Memories are not stored like photographs in a drawer. Every time you remember something, you slightly rewrite it. The act of remembering changes the thing remembered. That's not philosophy, that's experiment. So now we're in a funny position. You feel like a continuous self moving through time, but physically you are a process that is constantly replacing its parts and revising its internal structure. Like a river that keeps its name even though all the water has flowed past. People have argued about this for thousands of years. They give it clever names. They tell stories about ships whose planks are replaced one by one. But the important thing is not the story. The important thing is that nature doesn't care about our labels. Nature only cares about what happens next. Your sense of I is generated fresh, moment by moment. It feels continuous because the system is very good at handing off information from one moment to the next, like frames of a movie projected fast enough that you don't see the gaps. Now imagine the projector slows down, or skips frames, or stops. We've all seen this in small ways. You fall asleep, you wake up, hours are gone, and yet you don't feel like you died and were reborn. The continuity you feel is reconstructed after the fact. The brain stitches together a story and says, yes, that was still me. Anesthesia does something similar but more brutally. One moment you're counting backward, the next moment you're waking up, and nothing in between exists for you at all. No experience of waiting, no darkness, no passage of time, just a cut. That should bother you a little because it tells you something crucial. Conscious experience does not persist just because time passes. It persists only if the machinery keeps running. So now ask the dangerous question. If your sense of self can vanish for hours and then resume without complaint, what exactly is it that you're afraid of losing at death? Is it continuity? But continuity already breaks. Is it memory? But memory is already unreliable and constantly changing. Is it identity? But identity is a story told by a machine about its own activity. This is not meant to be depressing. It's meant to strip away fake solidity. Because once you stop pretending the self is a thing, you can ask a much more interesting question. If the self is a process, not an object, then immortality doesn't mean lasting forever. It means something else entirely. And we're not ready to say what yet. When people hear all this, they usually jump to a conclusion too fast. They say, so that's it. We're just temporary patterns, and then we vanish. And again, that sounds like an answer, but it's not careful enough, because patterns don't behave the way objects do. Take a wave in the ocean. You can point to it. You can surf on it. You can measure its height and speed, but it's not made of a particular chunk of water. The water comes and goes. The wave is a pattern moving through matter. When the wave reaches the shore and disappears, the water doesn't vanish. The pattern just stops being sustained. Now here's the part that matters. While the wave exists, it can do things. It can move a boat. It can erode rock. It can transfer energy to other waves. The fact that it doesn't last forever doesn't make it unreal or unimportant. A flame is another good example. A candle flame looks like a thing, but if you chase the atoms, they're constantly changing. Wax molecules come in, react with oxygen, fly away as hot gas. The flame persists only because the process continues. Blow it out and nothing spooky leaves the room. But while it was burning, it mattered. It lit the room, it warmed your hand, it changed the surroundings. So when you think about yourself as a pattern, you shouldn't imagine something fragile and pointless. You should imagine something active, a process that participates in the world. Your thoughts don't just sit there. They cause things, they move your muscles, they shape your decisions, they affect other people's brains, which then go on to do other things. The pattern in your head couples to patterns outside your head. This is where the usual idea of immortality starts to look a little childish. People imagine a little version of themselves drifting off intact, like a suitcase put on a cosmic conveyor belt. But that picture assumes the self is a sealed object, and it isn't. You are leaky. Every conversation you've had has changed someone else's internal wiring, even if just a little. Every idea you've shared has replicated itself imperfectly in other brains. You are not bounded by your skin in the way people like to pretend. Now be careful. This is not the same as saying you live on in some poetic sense. That's another vague phrase that pretends to explain something. The question is more precise than that. What aspects of the pattern continue to have consequences after the machinery stops? When a flame goes out, the heat it released doesn't vanish. It's dispersed. The room is slightly warmer. The air has changed composition. The world is different than it would have been otherwise. When a person dies, the organized process that generated thoughts stops, but the consequences of those thoughts don't rewind. They propagate forward in other people, in records, in changed environments. That's not immortality in the fairy tale sense, but it's also not nothing. The trouble is, this still doesn't touch the core discomfort. You're not worried about consequences. You're worried about experience. You want to know if there will be something it's like to be you after death. That's a much sharper question. And to answer it, we have to talk about time in a way that most people never do. And time is where things get really slippery. When people talk about death, they usually imagine a moment, a last breath, a final heartbeat, a sharp dividing line between before and after. That's a very human way to picture it. Nature doesn't actually care for sharp lines. To see why, we have to talk about time, and not in the poetic way. In the physical way, you feel like you're moving through time, like it's a river carrying you along, past behind you, future ahead. But that picture is suspicious. It's a picture drawn by your brain, not by the equations. In physics, time is more like a dimension than a flow. Events are arranged, not pushed. Your birth is an event. Your breakfast this morning is an event. Your death will be an event. They don't erase each other. They don't overwrite each other. They're just there. That already sounds strange, so let's ground it. Imagine a long trail on a mountain. You walk along it. From where you're standing, some parts are behind you, some ahead, but the trail itself isn't being created as you walk. It already exists as a whole. Your experience of walking it is local, limited, sequential, but the structure of the trail doesn't depend on your awareness of it. Your life, in this view, is like a path through time, a world line, if you want the technical word. While you're alive, your brain constructs the feeling of now as it moves along that path. When the brain stops, the feeling stops, but the path doesn't get erased. Now be very careful here. This does not mean you are secretly conscious forever. That's the mistake people make when they hear this idea. Consciousness is something that happens at certain regions along the path where the machinery is running. Outside those regions, there is no experience, just like there's no walking happening on parts of the trail where you're not present. But notice what has quietly changed. The question, what happens after I die, assumes that after is the right word. After exists only from the point of view of an experience moving along. From the point of view of the whole structure, your life is a finite pattern in time, complete. That may sound cold, but think about what it removes. It removes the idea that everything meaningful is being continuously destroyed by the present moment slipping away. Your childhood is not gone in the same way a burned piece of paper is gone. It's a region of space-time where a certain pattern existed, fixed, untouchable. The same is true of every moment you were conscious. Those moments don't need to be preserved by a cosmic memory system. They already are what they are. Now here's the twist that usually makes people uneasy. If consciousness is tied to local physical processes, then asking whether you will experience being dead is like asking whether a stopped clock experiences 3 o'clock. Experience is not something that fills empty time. It's something that happens when conditions are right. So death is not an endless blackness. Blackness is still an experience. Death is the absence of experience altogether. That's a hard thing to imagine, because imagination itself requires experience. And that's why the real puzzle isn't death, it's life. Why there is ever something it's like to be anything at all. Once you stare at that long enough, the fear starts to shift. And that shift is where the last pieces of the puzzle are hiding. Here's where I usually stop and say something that sounds like a cheat. We don't actually know why consciousness exists at all. And anyone who tells you they do is either confused or selling something. But not knowing is not the same as knowing nothing. We know some very important things. We know that consciousness shows up when matter is organized in certain complicated, self-referential ways. Not when it's simple, not when it's static, but when it's busy, layered, full of feedback loops that refer back to themselves. The system watches itself, watching itself. Somewhere in that mess, experience appears. That's not mystical. It's strange, but it's physical. You can see hints of this everywhere. A pile of sand is just a pile of sand, but put many simple units together with the right rules, and suddenly you get patterns that weren't in any individual grain. Swarms move like organisms. Markets panic. Weather forms spirals. None of the parts intend this. The behavior emerges from interaction. Your mind is like that, except turned inward. So now let's return to immortality, because by now the usual version should feel unsatisfying. Eternal personal experience doesn't fit with what we know about how experience depends on machinery. But that doesn't mean the universe is hostile to meaning. It means meaning has a different shape than we were taught. The deepest mistake is thinking that experience has to be continuous forever to matter at all. That's like saying a song is pointless unless it never ends. The value of the song is not in its infinite duration. It's in its structure, its internal relationships, the way one note leads to the next. Your life is a finite pattern, but it's a real one. It's not a race just because it stops. The fact that it has a beginning and an end is not a flaw. It's a defining feature. Now here's the part that's really unsettling if you think about it carefully. If consciousness is something that happens whenever matter is organized the right way, then it is not uniquely tied to your particular atoms, not even to your particular history. In principle, any system with the same relevant organization would generate the same kind of experience. That's not science fiction. That's a logical consequence of taking physics seriously, which raises a question most people avoid because it's uncomfortable. If a pattern like you can happen once, why not again? Not a continuation, not a resurrection, but a reoccurrence. Another instance of the same kind of process, somewhere else in the vast possibilities of the universe. Now be careful. This does not mean you will wake up somewhere else and remember your name. Memory is part of the machinery. Without the causal chain, there is no personal continuity. But the universe doesn't owe continuity to anyone. It only obeys its rules. So the idea of immortality starts to dissolve into something much stranger. Not a single unbroken self marching forward forever, but the fact that the kind of process you are is not forbidden. It can exist whenever conditions allow it. That's not comforting in the traditional way. It doesn't give you a storybook ending. But it does something else. It shifts the focus away from personal survival and toward the astonishing fact that experience happens at all, even briefly, in a universe that doesn't have to care. And once you really take that in, the final question is no longer, will I exist after death? The real question becomes why existence ever gets to ask questions about itself in the first place. That's where we have to finish. So let's end where we should have started, with a kind of honesty that doesn't try to sell you comfort. When you die, there is no final movie, no darkness, no waiting room, no cosmic narrator clearing his throat. All of those are still experiences. An experience requires a working machine. When the machine stops, there is simply no experience happening there anymore. That sounds like a letdown only if you expected the universe to owe you a sequel. But now notice something remarkable. Right now, this moment is already unbelievably strange. For billions of years, the atoms that make up your body were doing other things. They were in stars, in oceans, in rocks. No experience, no questions. Then for a brief stretch of cosmic time, they're arranged just so, and suddenly the universe has a point of view. That's not trivial. That's outrageous. You don't need immortality to make that meaningful. The meaning is in the fact that it happened at all, that the laws of physics permit little pockets of matter to wake up, look around, and wonder what's going on. People worry that if there's no personal afterlife, then life is pointless. I think they've got it backwards. If life were endless, it would be the things you do now that wouldn't matter. Scarcity is what gives structure. Finite is what gives shape. A joke with no ending isn't funny. A song that never resolves becomes noise. A life that goes on forever has no urgency, no weight. The fact that this ends is not a bug. It's the feature that makes any of it count. You are not a ghost temporarily inhabiting a body. You are something the universe is doing right here, right now. A process, a pattern, a question asking itself. And when that process stops, the universe doesn't lose what happened. Nothing needs to be stored or remembered by a higher authority. The moments you lived are part of the structure of reality in exactly the same way a supernova or a sunrise is. The mistake is thinking you have to be around later to justify being here now. So what happens when you die? Nothing happens to you because you are not a thing that can have something happen to it once the process ends. But something extraordinary has already happened. Matter organized itself long enough to care. That's not immortality. It's better than that. It's real.